So, welcome all. So, as the coordinating professor of FCAI Research Program number 4, Privacy-Preserving and Secure AI, I will be giving the sort of state of the program presentation and also talking about some of our recent work, especially in privacy-preserving data sharing. But you've probably seen the FCAI mission encapsulated in this figure. So the goal of providing real AI for real people and real world that we aim to address through solving these 3 key bottleneck questions, which we've identified as data efficiency, understandability, and trust and ethics. And as we are talking about privacy-preserving and secure AI, it's clear that this we will be contributing heavily towards this trust and ethics part of the triangle, and we aim to do that by creating, so as we sort of the mission statement is to creating AI systems that can operate in presence of adversaries, attempting to circumvent the systems by, for instance, stealing data models or trying to evade models. So that's sort of the big picture. For the time being, there's been some changes in personnel, and we lost the leader of the secure AI side, Professor Ashokan. So at the moment, we are mainly focusing on privacy through developing these differential private machine learning methods. And by doing these methods, we actually, in addition to the obvious trust and ethics, we also hope to also address the data efficiency more from the supply side, so that by creating machine learning methods for which we can give guarantees that they will not violate anyone's privacy, we hope that that will enable us to learn these models using data that we potentially couldn't access otherwise. So a practical example might be that there are some, say, health data collections in different European countries, but then there's national legislation that prevents pooling them. But by creating a suitable privacy-preserving system, we could then hopefully pool them under such a system. And specifically, so the work that we are doing is based on all based on this concept of differential privacy, where the idea is that this gives a very strong notion of privacy that was introduced by Cynthia Dwork in early 2000s and Dwork and colleagues. And the idea is that an algorithm satisfies this differential privacy if, when we take any 2 data sets in the universe of possible data sets and consider pairs that differ by the contribution of a single individual into the data set, then differential privacy requires that the outcome of the algorithm, and specifically the probability of obtaining any specific outcome, should not change too much when we replace this one individual's data. And how much this can change is controlled by a privacy parameter, usually denoted by epsilon. And sort of this, in a sense, this can be thought of as giving a plausible deniability for the data subjects, because now if you contributed to this data set, being the sort of this individual who we are considering here, then you can always say that, well, even if you took me out and replaced me with anyone else, the results couldn't have changed very dramatically. So therefore, you can't learn too much about what my contribution to the data set was. And the same guarantee is given to every single individual, but only one individual at the time. So this still enables learning global properties of the data set and averages and that kind of things. Why this is good is that it provides protection against also against adversaries with site information, which has been a weakness in many previous attempts to define privacy. What makes it nice for machine learning is that it's, for instance, it's invariant to post-processing, so we can take the output of a differentially private mechanism, perform any additional computation on that, and the result will remain differentially private. And also, if we run many queries on the same data set, it doesn't break down immediately, but there's this graceful degradation, and we can compute what is the cumulative privacy loss from these repeated queries. So much for the abstract theory. So then let's go for the simplest possible example of these of a differentially private algorithm, which is a randomized response, which was originally proposed in the 50s. I've apparently lost the reference in this version of the slides. So in this algorithm, respondents are asked some potentially embarrassing query, such as, are you currently using illegal drugs? And they are instructed to answer it as follows. So first, flip a fair coin. If this coin gives tails, then you respond truthfully. If it gives head, then you flip the coin again and respond whatever the second coin tells. So this introduces this randomness into the responses, which in a sense gives this the same plausible deniability that was in the definition of differential privacy. So even if you answer yes, you can always claim that, well, it was just a coin. I'm not really doing it. But again, if we look at this, so we can't learn too much from a single individual, but as we combine these responses from a large population of respondents, then we can look at the statistics and can get fairly accurate estimates of what is the rate of drug usage in this population. And it can easily be seen that this mechanism satisfies the epsilon differential privacy with epsilon roughly equal to 1 by simply looking at the cases. So we see that the true answer is always 3 times more likely than the false answer here. And this magical epsilon around 1 is good to keep in mind, because the other results I will be showing for much more complex mechanisms will be enjoying the same level of privacy as this very simple mechanism. So sort of gives some way of thinking of what this epsilon means. Also, now if we wanted to make this, if we want to change epsilon in this particular algorithm, we could do it by simply adjusting the probability that one will answer truthfully. So if we sort of make it more likely that the person will answer randomly, then the privacy guarantee will be stronger and the epsilon will be smaller, and so on. Okay, so this is a very simple mechanism that's very useful for social sciences, but there's not much machine learning you can do with these simple binary questions. So let's jump immediately to the very other extreme of DP mechanisms, one that's very useful for machine learning. Differentially private stochastic gradient descent. And this is just to illustrate kind of how we can take a well-known algorithm and then turn it into differentially private. So here we assume that we have some objective that can be expressed as a sum over samples in a data set. And we further assume that each sample comes from a different individual whose privacy we wish to protect. So the standard stochastic gradient algorithm for optimizing this would be that we compute gradients of a subset of these and then update the parameters according to the gradient. Now for the DP version, we need to have a few additional steps. The first one is we compute these gradients for each individual term, and then we clip them so that there's the 2 norm of all these per example gradients is bounded. This allows us to bound the sensitivity, so basically how much one individual can contribute to the total outcome. Stochastic gradient, you do subsampling. That's actually a good thing for differential privacy. It gives you tighter privacy bounds. And finally, we add up all the gradient computations. But then in order to get this privacy, we also need to add a little bit of noise. And in this case, the noise would typically be Gaussian. And then, as I mentioned, we would be doing this repeatedly. So then we need to apply so-called composition theorems or a privacy accountant to compute the total privacy cost of the entire algorithm. But basically, in terms of the algorithm, the components you need is compute these per example gradients, clip them, add a bit of noise, then just compute how much privacy you got. But that's it. So no fundamental changes to the algorithm. Okay, so how does this apply in the big picture? So basically what we are looking for in many cases is developing methods that allow us to learn models, possibly predictive models, could also be generative models, from data that is sort of sitting behind a privacy wall. And specific work we've done in our research program towards these goals in the past few years include a fair bit of work in developing basic algorithms for Bayesian inference under differential privacy. So a few years back, we introduced DP variational inference, which is basically applying this DP stochastic gradient for variational inference. And very recently, so we have a new paper on differential private Markov chain Monte Carlo, which is the first DP algorithm that actually computes the privacy laws for an entire MCMC chain, and therefore we get a privacy guarantee that doesn't depend on things like sampling from the exact posterior as some of the previous ones would. And so we will be presenting this as a spotlight at NeurIPS in December. We've also been working on algorithms, more general algorithms for machine learning. So one work by Antti Honkela has been on learning rate adaptation for differential private SGD, which is important because these things like using a validation set to find hyperparameters gets much more difficult when you have to satisfy the privacy guarantees, because then you can't really look at the data set several times without paying a privacy cost for that or somehow being very careful. And also, there's some very recent work on numerical methods for exact privacy accounting. So that this was the bit that was needed for the last part of the DPSGD for basically computing how much privacy we have lost. And so basically, there's been this chain of work providing different theorems for bounding that, and now we are sort of aiming for the exact value using some numerical techniques. I mentioned about this privacy in the distributed data case, which is of course very important, because often many of these simple algorithms assume that there's sort of a trusted aggregator with whom we can share all the data, but that's not always the case. So this distributed setting is very important for many applications. So that's more on the sort of foundational side. Then on the applications, one big motivating example for us has been precision medicine and especially predicting sensitivity of cancer cell lines to cancer drugs. And that took a long time to do, but we eventually last year published the first method to successfully predict the sensitivity using gene expression data with only very limited training data. So we took the biggest data set available for this particular problem, which was about 1,000 samples, and that's just very small for differential privacy because typically kind of you just need a bit more data to get comparable results. We also had some more recent work showing how we can sort of use additional public data to learn a low-dimensional representation for this gene expression, which further improves the privacy. Another very interesting application that we've been working on recently is using differential privacy for data anonymization and data sharing, and I will be using the rest of the talk for talking in more detail about that. So what is the issue here? Obviously, modern AI and machine learning is highly dependent on having data, and so kind of the more data you have, the better. But unfortunately, many of the interesting problems require looking at data that is about some human behavior or human activities that have some privacy concerns. In the past, around 10 years ago, there were sort of many attempts of helping get this research in the field started by sharing some of these data sets and sort of to promote research. And but then there was quite a bit of backlash. So sort of the examples here include the American internet provider AOL releasing some presumably anonymized web search queries, which then a reporter took and basically went out and found one person who was a specific user in this data set. A very prominent example was in the state of Massachusetts, where they released some health records, again, presumably anonymized by removing names and sort of obviously identifying identifiers. But then there was a researcher who took this and combined this. There was some potentially identifying sort of demographic information remaining, like dates of birth and zip codes. So then there was this researcher who took this and combined it with publicly available voter registries and re-identified the, I think it was Massachusetts state governor, and then basically gave him his own data from this anonymized data set, and that caused quite a stir. And finally, there was this Netflix challenge and Netflix data set. And again, there were examples where using ratings posted on IMDb, researchers again could de-anonymize some of the users in the data set. And sort of in terms of the health data we are looking at, and where we often need genome data, this actually gets even more tricky, because the genome is ultimately kind of the ultimate identifier. And there's been some interesting work of identifying published personal genomes by, again, using some additional databases. So, anonymized data would certainly be very useful, because it would enable many analysis without having to worry about privacy. But it's just very hard to do. And these examples on the previous slide were maybe among the more prominent ones. I'm sure there's plenty that didn't make quite as big headlines. And I think kind of partly sort of due to this history, the new European General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, that came into force last year, actually takes a very strong definition on anonymity, and basically says that one must not, for data to be considered anonymized, one must not be able to link this back to individuals, even using any external databases. And this is a very strong requirement. It's also not enough to satisfy this at the time of publishing. You have to satisfy that for all future. So you have to sort of revisit this from time to time. So it's quite obvious that, I mean, just looking at this, obviously identifying features like names and social security numbers is certainly not enough to guarantee anonymity. But now this is actually where I think kind of the differential privacy guarantee, which basically says that the result of a differential private computation does not change too much, even if we change one individual's data, is a very good match here. Because that basically says that we can bound how strong the link from the result of a differential private computation to a given individual is. It doesn't guarantee perfect anonymity, but we can sort of probabilistically bound how likely it is that you can breach this anonymity guarantee. And Yeah, so this is what I think is sort of our best bet towards satisfying the GDPR requirements. And so the one interesting aspect of this is that, I mean, as we look at these examples of sort of claimed anonymity breaches from differential private computation, often these are more of breaches of the form, well, there is some relationship in the universe. So let's say that, I mean, it's not so much about the computation, but it's more about kind of some universal truth that if you release someone's, let's say, color of eyes, you can learn something about the genetics of that particular person. But the same would be true regardless of whether you create a model to learn this and then release that model. And in many cases, when you look carefully for these, it's actually, I mean, DP doesn't prevent people, it just tells how much more you can learn from the results of the computation. But if you knew from other points that, I mean, some person has blue eyes, and sort of we know that blue-eyed people have a certain genetic traits, I mean, obviously kind of there's no way to prevent someone from sort of using that knowledge. But this is something that makes it very hard to analyze these, because kind of sometimes it may be that this external data actually gives you sort of a lot, but I think kind of DP is a very strong guarantee in the sense that it kind of you can't learn too much from this particular publication of or release of a computation result. Okay, so how do we do it? I guess, I mean, if we think about DP mechanisms, the basic idea is that we want to construct a DP mechanism such that the outcome of the mechanism would be approximately the same as the data set that we put in. Obviously, this is impossible because the result should not change too much, even if we change the data set by a single individual, and that could be any one of the individuals. So kind of the key here is in some sense. So our approach builds upon this DP machine learning and probabilistic modeling that we've been doing using a generative modeling approach. So we take the data, we learn a generative, usually probabilistic model, and then we use that to generate new data. And because of the invariance to post-processing of DP, if we perform this training of the generative model under differential privacy, then the generated data will enjoy the same guarantees. So the way I like to think about this is that we are essentially synthesizing sort of new individuals from the same population as the original. These are not linked to any of the same individuals, but if our generative model is good, we can capture the data generating distribution, and then we can generate new examples from the same population. And these should have similar statistical properties as the original, but none of them can be linked directly back to any of the individuals in the original data set. So more formally, given some data set of n individuals, our goal is to learn a generative probabilistic model, which in our works, in many cases, we've used a mixture model, although it depends on the data set, and in many cases, some more advanced models like a variational autoencoded neural networks are can be quite a bit better. But the learning algorithm is basically the same. Here we've used the differential private variational inference to learn a posterior approximation over the parameters. And then using this approximation, we can generate new data by first sampling the parameters from this approximation, and then sampling new individuals from this predictive model. And really the privacy guarantee is maintained. Now you may ask, why are we releasing the data set instead of the original model? And the reason for that is that data happens to be the universal language for all of data science and machine learning. if you have a machine learning algorithm, you can be sure that it will accept as input some data. If you instead you had a approximate posterior distribution from some complex model, and then you would want to try to do some further analysis on that, it would be way more difficult and not generally possible. But data you can always use for anything. And the algorithm, this is actually the same slide again, just changing the title to DP variational inference. But I mean, as the algorithm, we just use the same differential private stochastic gradient descent that I presented earlier. And as an example, we have been using this to analyze a data set, a large epidemiological data set that has quite sensitive information on medication, demographic data, and mortality for about 200,000 Finnish female and male individuals with totally 10 features. And this is a data set where I think it's like matched in a sense that half of these individuals are diabetic and half are matched controls. And the goal of the original study was to study the alcohol-related mortality among diabetics to basically see if there's a difference between non-diabetic and diabetic individuals. The original study used a Poisson regression model to identify factors that are associated with differences in mortality between these within this population. And we have basically reproduced the results on an anonymized version of the data set to see how well they replicate. So here, this is actually, I think, showing an average of 100 repetitions of doing the differentially private data generation and sort of learning the model. And so basically we can see that and then fitting this Poisson regression model. And this is showing the parameters of the Poisson regression. And as we can see, there's quite a nice correspondence between these. Not all these are perfectly estimated. I'll come back to that a bit later. But for the purpose of this study, these key coefficients are the ones here, which are then the basis of these statistical discoveries that were in the data set. And they are pretty well estimated in this example. So here's sort of summarizing over these 100 repeats how often we can make the correct discoveries, how often we find sort of the correct sign for the effect, but don't get the same statistical significance as in the original, and then possibly even getting cases with a wrong sign while being statistically insignificant, and the worst of all, getting a wrong sign and statistically significant. So this would be sort of getting things totally wrong. And as we see here, things are looking pretty good. As we are increasing the epsilon, we get sort of almost perfect reproducibility of the results. So there's sort of three different effects we are looking at, then a combined one. And sort of the most difficult one is the one where there's sort of a very small number of individuals. If we look at the bigger ones, then we are doing very good. And again here, obviously it's a factor of what's the size of the effect and size of the population, how well we can do here. So this was for male individuals. We've also done the same for females. That turns out to be a bit more difficult because there's less females dying of alcohol-related causes here. So there were about 1,600 men and I think about 400 female with this. So therefore, especially with a sort of tighter privacy, the results are not as good. But again, I mean, if we sort of are happy with slightly weaker privacy guarantees, then we can do pretty well in most cases, except for this one case where there's a very small group with this particular treatment. And this is sort of a pattern we see a lot that's sort of very consistent with the way differential privacy is defined. So this is showing the error in the estimation of these regression coefficients in the DP relative to prevalence of the attribute this regression coefficient is measuring. So we see that the largest errors by far come from these very rare attributes. So if we have attributes that have sort of less than 50 individuals in the original data set, we need to guarantee privacy for all of these. So that means that there will be sort of larger differences, and it's going to be very, very hard to estimate these accurately. Whereas then if we go for these more common ones, then they are much, much more accurately estimated. So this is something we see a lot, and I tend to think about it as sort of a necessary feature of differential privacy, in the sense that because we are giving this protection to every individual, then necessarily, assuming kind of there was some feature that only was represented by a single individual, then kind of there would be very little we could do about that. And again, if it's a small number of individuals, then sort of we're going to make much, much bigger errors here. So here's another kind of quite different example. I don't unfortunately have the time to go more into the detail, but this is just showing sort of another possible challenge. So now we are looking at the accuracy of estimating feature covariance in data about mobile apps, and this is comparing plotted again versus the dimensionality of the data set. So again, here we see sort of another challenge is that, if the data dimensionality is pretty small, then we are doing well. But as the dimensionality increases, then the sort of error, which is represented by the solid lines, tends to go up. So that's sort of another challenge. The previous data set was nice because there were a relatively small number of features, but if we have sort of small number of individuals and very many features, then things get really difficult. So that brings me to the conclusion, which I've divided in 3 parts. So first, generally about why we need privacy. I didn't talk about it so much here, but there is sort of the converse of the DP definition is, and there's some theory that shows that any algorithms that use private data will remember some part of that and can potentially be used to compromise the privacy of the input data. And there's some quite striking examples of how machine learning models do remember their training data and can be used to compromise the privacy of the data subjects. Differential privacy is a very useful tool here because it can provide strong privacy guarantees, but there is a price to pay. That especially if you have a more complex task, not too much data, then that may limit the accuracy of the results. But obviously, we are working hard to make this as little as possible. But there are some theoretical limits that simply can't be overcome here. In the FCAI research program, we are doing a lot of work in this fundamentals of differential private machine learning and Bayesian inference, thus linking to other areas of FCAI, and also looking at these applications especially in this precision medicine and data anonymization. And for the data sharing, my claim here is that there are certainly cases where these differential private algorithms can be extremely useful for anonymizing data and then further sharing it, because they give this very strong guarantee of true anonymity. That's very hard to do otherwise. And in our examples, we've seen that the These methods tend to preserve large patterns well. So if you're looking at sort of the overall big trends in the data set, those are captured quite extremely accurately even. But then if you have some rare properties and you're looking at sort of very weak signals, then that's just by definition much, much more difficult. So with that, I'd like to thank all the co-authors who've done most of the actual work I've presented. So especially for the data sharing part, so Joonas Jalkó here has been leading that quite heavily. Yeah, thanks.